Please see this first. Annie Carter held out her phone, but Grant Hollister didn't take it. His eyes remained fixed on the security monitor behind her, frozen on the worst possible moment. Annie in her night shift uniform, a crowbar in her hand, standing before the damaged door to Harold Bennett's office. "Miss Carter, I don't think you understand how serious this is," Grant said, struggling to keep his anger under control. "You opened a restricted security panel in the middle of the night, damaged company property, and forced your way into an office containing confidential financial records. I've watched the footage twice." "I know what the footage shows, Mr. Hollister," Annie replied. Her voice was low, but there was urgency beneath it. "I'm not saying I didn't open the panel or break the lock. I'm asking you to let me explain why I did it." Victor Hale, standing beside Grant, gave a restrained shake of his head. "There really isn't anything to explain. The rules on restricted offices are clear, and Miss Carter was never authorized to touch that system." Annie looked at Victor, then back at Grant. "I wasn't trying to get into Mr. Bennett's office because I wanted something in there. Somebody needed help." Victor cut in before she could continue. "Grant, this is exactly what happens when an employee realizes the camera has caught them. The story changes after the fact." Annie's fingers tightened around her phone. "I'm not changing anything." Grant's irritation grew. "Enough. Don't try to say anything else. The images on the screen are already clear enough, and I don't have much patience for explanations that only come after you've been caught red-handed." "But, please," Annie said, her voice trembling. "Then answer me one question," he interrupted her. "Did you use that screwdriver to open the security panel?" "Yes, sir, but only after." "And did you use the pry bar from your cleaning cart to force the door?" "Yes, but Mr. Bennett." "So the footage is accurate." "The footage is accurate," Annie said, her breathing growing uneven, "but it doesn't show what happened before that." Victor sighed and glanced at Grant. "We're going in circles. She violated the policy, and she admits it." Grant looked directly at Annie. "Turn in your badge." For the first time, the fear in her face became unmistakable. Annie touched the plastic badge clipped to her waistband, but she did not remove it. "Mr. Hollister, please. I know you don't have any reason to trust me right now, but I'm asking you to give me 1 minute. You've already had several. Then give me one more." Victor stepped forward. "Miss Carter, you've been given an instruction." Annie flinched slightly, but she stayed where she was. "Please, Mr. Hollister." "I have proof." Grant's expression hardened. "Proof of what?" "That I wasn't breaking in. I was trying to get to someone." Victor laughed under his breath. "And we're supposed to believe you happen to have evidence ready?" Annie turned toward him, and for the first time a trace of anger broke through her fear. "I didn't make the evidence for you. It was already on my phone because it happened." "Victor," Grant said quietly. "Let her finish." Victor's mouth tightened, but he stepped back. Annie looked at Grant again. Her hand was trembling now. "I understand why you're angry. If all I saw was that video, maybe I'd think the same thing. But the camera doesn't have sound, and it starts showing me after I'd already been standing outside that office for several minutes. Please, just look before you decide what kind of person I am." Something in that last sentence stopped him. She was not denying the damage. She was not blaming someone else for what her hands had done. More importantly, she was not begging for money or trying to negotiate a softer punishment. She was asking him to look. Grant finally extended his hand. "All right, show me." Relief crossed Annie's face, but only for a second. She placed the phone in his palm and pointed to the call history. 3 outgoing calls appeared one beneath another. "As you can see, I made 3 calls at 11:40, 1 p.m., 11:43 p.m., and 11:45 p.m. And of course, I can't alter these call records." Grant frowned. "These all went to the night security desk?" "Yes, sir. I called 3 times because nobody answered." Victor immediately stepped closer. "That needs to be verified. The desk was scheduled to be staffed." "I don't know who was scheduled," Annie said. "I only know nobody picked up." Grant looked from the phone to her. "Why were you calling security in the first place?" "I was pushing my cart past Mr. Bennett's office when I heard something hit the floor. At first I thought something had fallen off a desk, so I stopped. Then I heard him call for help. "You're certain it was Harold Bennett?" "I am now, because I found him inside." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Found him?" Annie nodded and reached for the phone. "There's something else. I was recording a message to my supervisor about missing cleaning supplies when I heard the noise." The recording kept running. She touched the screen. The room filled with the faint sound of cartwheels crossing tile. A dull crash came next, heavy enough to make Grant look automatically toward the conference room door. Then came several seconds of silence. Finally, a weak male voice whispered through the speaker, "Help somebody." Grant's anger vanished so quickly that Annie could see it happen. "Play that again," he said. She did. This time nobody interrupted. When the voice came through a second time, Grant slowly looked toward the frozen security image of Annie holding the pry bar. "What happened after you heard that?" "I knocked and called Mr. Bennett's name. He answered once, but he sounded worse. I called security, and nobody answered. I tried the emergency access button beside the door, but the panel flashed system error." Grant pointed toward the monitor. "So that's why you opened the panel?" "Yes. I thought maybe I could reset it. I didn't know if it would work, but I was running out of things to try. And when it didn't, I called security again. Then again. Mr. Bennett stopped answering me, so I took the pry bar and forced the lock." Victor spoke more cautiously now. "And when you got inside?" He was on the floor beside his desk with one hand against his chest. "I called 911, brought the AED from outside the conference room, and stayed with him until the paramedics arrived." Grant turned toward Victor. "Where is Bennett?" Victor hesitated. "He was transported to the hospital." Grant stared at him. "You knew there had been a medical emergency?" "I knew Mr. Bennett had been taken by ambulance. I was reviewing the security violation separately." Annie looked at Grant. "I also filed an incident report before I left." Victor's head turned sharply. "There is no incident report." "Yes, there is. I submitted it at 2:08 this morning from the staff terminal downstairs. I remember the time because I missed my bus afterward." Grant's face became still. "What did you put in it?" "The 3 unanswered calls, the failed access panel, Mr. Bennett asking for help, and why I broke the door." Victor shook his head. "Nothing like that exists in the system." Grant slowly turned toward him. "Then we have a different problem." He picked up the conference phone and pressed the button for internal security. "Get the night security supervisor up here immediately, and bring whoever was assigned to that desk between 11:30 and midnight." Victor frowned. "Grant, we should verify the records before this gets out of proportion." Grant looked again at Annie's phone, at the 3 unanswered calls, then at the silent footage that had seemed so conclusive only minutes earlier. "No," he said, his voice quieter now. "I think we've already spent too much time trusting the wrong record." Annie said nothing. Grant looked at her badge, still clipped to her uniform, and felt the weight of what had nearly happened. 1 minute of anger, 1 silent video, and 1 incomplete report had been enough for him to condemn an employee who had broken a door for no reason except that a man on the other side might have been dying. Now someone was going to explain why her calls had gone unanswered, and why the report that could have proved she was telling the truth had disappeared. Grant waited until the conference room door clicked shut behind the security supervisor, then turned back to Annie. The anger that had filled his voice only minutes earlier was gone, but his expression remained tense. He pulled out a chair across from her and gestured toward the seat. "Sit down, Miss Carter. I want you to tell me exactly what happened tonight, from the first moment you heard something wrong until the ambulance left. Don't leave anything out because you think it sounds unimportant." Annie sat carefully, still holding her phone. Victor Hale remained near the security monitor. "Grant, we already know the general sequence," he said. "There's no reason to turn this into a full interrogation in the middle of the night." "I'm not interrogating her," Grant replied. "I'm finally listening to her. There's a difference." Victor said nothing more, though the tightening around his mouth made his opinion clear. Grant looked at Annie. "Where were you when you first heard Mr. Bennett?" "I was pushing my cart past the conference room on the 34th floor. I'd finished cleaning there and was heading toward the elevators when I heard something heavy hit the floor inside his office." "Did you know he was still working?" "I had seen light under his door earlier, but I didn't know for sure he was inside. I stopped, knocked, and called his name. At first, I didn't hear anything, so I almost kept going. Then I heard him say something. What did he say? Annie's fingers tightened around the phone. The first time I couldn't understand him. I leaned closer to the door, and then I heard, "Help." He sounded weak, like he was having trouble getting enough air. Grant leaned forward. What did you do immediately after that? I called the night security desk. Victor spoke before she could continue. That number goes directly to the main console. If someone was assigned there, the call should have been received. Annie turned toward him. I let it ring until it stopped. Nobody picked up. Grant's eyes moved to Victor. Let her finish before we start explaining what should have happened. Annie took a breath. I knocked again and asked Mr. Bennett if he could open the door. He didn't answer clearly. I heard him trying to breathe, so I called security a second time. And again, nobody answered? No, sir. Grant glanced toward the frozen image on the monitor. Then you went to the access panel? Yes. There's an emergency call button beside the door, so I pressed it. Victor crossed his arms. That button sends an alert to security. It doesn't release the lock. I wasn't expecting it to unlock the door by itself, Annie said, trying to keep her voice even. I was trying to get someone to respond. What happened when you pressed it? Grant asked. The screen turned red and said system error. I waited a few seconds and tried again, but it froze. Victor shook his head. Panels sometimes take time to process a request. That doesn't mean the system failed. Annie looked directly at him. I pressed it 4 times. It didn't process anything. You're not trained to diagnose an electronic access system. No, I'm not, she replied a little more firmly. But I know what it looks like when a screen stops responding. Grant lifted a hand before Victor could answer. Did any confirmation appear? Anything saying the alert had been sent? Nothing. No confirmation, no green light, no sound. Just the error message. Grant's expression grew more serious. So at that point, you had called security twice. No one had answered. And the emergency panel wasn't working. Yes. Then I called security a 3rd time. And still nothing. Still nothing. Grant was quiet for a moment. What was happening with Mr. Bennett while all of this was going on? That was the part that scared me. He had stopped answering. Victor let out a restrained breath. That still didn't authorize you to dismantle the panel. Annie turned toward him, frustration finally breaking through. I wasn't trying to dismantle anything. I was trying to get the door open before he stopped breathing. Victor started to respond, but Grant's voice cut across him. Victor, please. She has been interrupted enough tonight. The room settled again. Grant nodded to Annie. Go on. She rubbed her thumb against the edge of her phone. I thought the panel might reset if I opened the cover. We keep a screwdriver on the cleaning cart for supply cabinets and floor grates, so I used it to remove the cover. I found a reset button inside and pressed it once. Did it work? For maybe 2 seconds. The screen came back, then turned red again with the same error. Grant looked toward the monitor. So you tried the system twice, and it failed twice. Yes. And that's when you used the pry bar. Annie nodded. I called Mr. Bennett's name again. There was no answer. I didn't know whether he had passed out or whether he was dying. So I stopped waiting. Victor's voice was quieter now. You understood you were damaging company property. I understood there was a man behind the door who wasn't answering me. If you understand why Annie chose to break that door instead of standing there and doing nothing, please give this video a like and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. You never know, someone near you might be watching this story right alongside you. Grant studied her for several seconds. How many times did you hit the lock? 3. The first time nothing moved. The second time the frame cracked. The third time it opened. And when you got inside, Mr. Bennett was on the floor beside his desk. His glasses had fallen under the chair, and he had one hand against his chest. He opened his eyes when I said his name, but he could barely speak. You called 911? Right away. The dispatcher asked if there was an AED nearby. I knew there was one outside the conference room because I clean around the cabinet every night. I brought it in, turned it on, and followed the instructions. It said no shock was advised, so I stayed with him and did exactly what the dispatcher told me until the paramedics arrived. Grant sat back slowly. After the ambulance left, what did you do? I went downstairs and filed an incident report. Victor immediately shook his head. There is no incident report in the system. Annie's face tightened. I filed one at 2:08 inches the morning. I remember because by the time I finished, I had missed my bus. Grant looked from her to Victor. What exactly did you put in that report? I wrote that security didn't answer 3 calls. I wrote that the emergency panel showed system error. I wrote that I opened the panel, tried to reset it, and then broke the door because Mr. Bennett had stopped answering. Victor walked to the terminal. I searched for her name and Bennett's earlier. Nothing came up. Search again, Grant said. Victor entered his credentials and ran several searches. Annie's name produced nothing. Harold Bennett produced nothing. The 34th floor produced nothing relevant. Annie stood. That can't be right. I watched the screen say the report had been submitted. Grant looked at her. Did it give you a reference number? For a few seconds. Yes, but I didn't write it down. I thought the report would stay there. Victor glanced over his shoulder. Without the number, there's no way to prove the report was ever entered. Grant's attention shifted to him. You said it isn't in the active system. What about deleted or archived records? Victor hesitated. Those require administrator access. You have administrator access. Yes, but normally we wouldn't. Tonight is not normal. Open the deletion log. Victor entered another password. A different screen appeared. Grant stepped closer as a list of system actions loaded. Then he stopped. An incident report had been created at 2:08 a.m. from a staff terminal. It had been opened the following morning under a facilities administrator account. Its current status read, removed from active system. Annie stared at the screen. That's my report. Grant said nothing for several seconds. He had nearly fired her because he trusted a silent video and a missing document more than the young woman standing in front of him. Now the system itself was confirming that she had told the truth. He slowly turned toward Victor. Who removed Annie Carter's report? Victor did not answer right away. His eyes remained on the deletion log, where the words, removed from active system, sat beside Annie's report like an accusation no one in the room wanted to touch. Grant broke the silence first. I asked you a question, Victor. Who removed it? I don't know yet, Victor said, his tone measured. That log only shows the administrator account. It doesn't tell us who was physically using it. Then find out. I will, but we shouldn't assume this was deliberate. Reports get archived, merged, or cleared during system maintenance. Annie looked at the screen. Mine wasn't old enough to archive. Victor turned toward her. You don't know how the system works. No, she said quietly, but I know I filed it last night. Grant held up a hand before Victor could respond. That part is no longer in dispute. Victor's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Grant picked up the conference phone and asked his assistant to confirm which hospital had received Harold Bennett. The answer came back within minutes. Harold had been taken to Northwestern Memorial and admitted after a cardiac emergency. Grant stood by the window while the call was transferred through the appropriate channels. He could not be given private medical details, but Harold's emergency contact had already informed the company that he was alive and stable enough for observation. Grant lowered the receiver and looked at Annie. He's alive. Annie closed her eyes for a second. Her shoulders dropped as though she had been holding them tight for hours. Thank God. Grant watched her carefully. That matters to you more than what happens to your job, doesn't it? Annie opened her eyes. Of course it does. Even after everything that happened tonight? She looked almost confused by the question. Mr. Bennett was on the floor and couldn't breathe. I didn't know if he was going to make it. Grant leaned one hand against the table. When you heard him behind that door, did you ever think about just waiting? Security could have come eventually. Annie glanced toward Victor, then back at Grant. Yes, I thought about it. What stopped you? He got quieter. Grant said nothing. Annie continued, her voice steadier now. The first time I heard him, he was able to say help. The next time, I could barely hear him. After that, nothing. I kept thinking that if I stood there because I was afraid of getting in trouble, and then somebody opened the door 10 minutes later and he was dead. She stopped and swallowed. I didn't think I could live with that. Victor shifted his weight. No one is suggesting you should have ignored a medical emergency. Annie turned toward him. That is what it felt like when nobody answered. Victor's expression hardened. Be careful not to confuse one unanswered desk with the whole company. Grant looked at him. 3 unanswered calls. A failed emergency panel. A missing report. I'm beginning to think the distinction matters less than you want it to. The room went quiet again. Grant looked back at Annie. When the paramedics arrived, did anyone tell you how serious Mr. Bennett's condition was? One of them asked how long he'd been down. I said I didn't know. Another asked who had found him. I told them I did. Did they say anything else? One of them told me it was good I called when I did. Victor interrupted. Paramedics say things like that to keep people calm. We shouldn't build conclusions around it. Grant's eyes sharpened. We're not building conclusions. We're establishing what happened. He walked over to the monitor and looked again at the paused image of Annie forcing the door. Only an hour earlier, the picture had seemed simple. Employee, tool, damaged lock, restricted office. Now it looked incomplete in a way that bothered him more than if the camera had failed entirely. He turned to Annie. I made a decision before I heard you. I shouldn't have. Annie did not answer. I'm withdrawing the termination. She studied his face. Does that mean the report about me breaking in is gone too? Grant paused. Victor answered first. The security incident still occurred. We can't erase an event because the circumstances changed. Annie's expression tightened. I'm not asking you to erase what happened. I'm asking what you're going to call it. Grant looked at her. She continued. If my file says I forced an office door and tampered with a security panel, then the next person who reads it is going to think exactly what you thought tonight. Grant's face changed slightly. Victor said, personnel records are factual. Then put all the facts in it, Annie replied. Her voice remained calm, but the words landed hard. Grant nodded slowly. You're right. Victor glanced at him. Grant, we need to be careful about revising records before an investigation is complete. I didn't say revise it tonight. I said she's right. Annie looked down at the badge, still clipped to her uniform. Am I supposed to go home now? Yes, Grant said. With pay for the rest of your shift. She shook her head. I'd rather finish. Grant stared at her. You've been here through a medical emergency. You've been questioned for nearly an hour, and I nearly fired you. Why would you want to finish your shift? Because the morning crew shouldn't have to clean the floors I left. Victor gave a small, incredulous breath. Grant ignored him. My father used to say something, Grant said after a moment. Annie looked up. He worked with his hands his whole life. He used to tell me, a job isn't just what people pay you to do. It's what your name looks like after you leave. Annie glanced toward the monitor. That's why I'm worried about what goes in my file. The answer struck him harder than he expected. Grant nodded. Then we'll make sure the file tells the truth. He looked at the scrape across her wrist. But before you touch another mop or bucket tonight, you're getting that hand cleaned. Annie almost smiled. That seems fair. As she turned toward the door, it opened before she reached it. A woman in her early 60s stepped inside carrying a leather folder and wearing a dark wool coat over a gray suit. She looked first at Grant, then at Victor, then at the security screen. Elaine, Grant said. Thanks for coming. Elaine Morrow closed the door behind her. Your message said a safety report disappeared after a medical emergency. That was enough to get me out of bed. Victor stepped forward. We don't know that it disappeared intentionally. Elaine's eyes moved to the deletion log, then to Annie. Who filed the report? I did, Annie said. Elaine nodded once. Then nobody touches that system again until I say so. Victor frowned. Elaine, facilities needs access to operate the building. You can operate the building. She placed the leather folder on the table. You just can't clean up anything else. Elaine Morrow did not sit down. She took off her gloves, placed them beside the leather folder, and looked at the screen showing Annie's deleted report. Before anyone explains what they think happened, I want to know what the systems show. Victor folded his arms. The report was removed from the active database. That doesn't mean someone deliberately erased it. Elaine glanced at him. Then we'll prove that one way or the other. Who has administrator access? Facilities managers, selected IT staff, and the reporting vendor. How many people? I'd have to check. Check. Victor gave Grant a brief look, but Grant nodded. Do it. While Victor moved to the terminal, Elaine turned to Annie. You're Annie Carter? Yes, ma'am. You filed the report at 2:08 this morning? Yes. Did anyone ask you to change it before you submitted it? No. Did anyone help you write it? No. Did you include the failed access panel? Yes. The 3 unanswered security calls? Yes. And that you forced the door because Mr. Bennett stopped responding? Annie nodded. I wrote all of that. Elaine studied her for a moment, then said, All right. Don't tell the story again tonight, unless I ask you something specific. You've already been made to repeat it enough. Annie's shoulders loosened slightly. Thank you. Grant watched the exchange. Elaine had been in the room less than 2 minutes and had already done something he had failed to do when Annie first arrived. She had treated the young woman's account as evidence worth preserving rather than an excuse that needed dismantling. Victor cleared his throat. There are 9 active administrator credentials with permission to modify incident records. Elaine walked over. Can the system tell us which credential opened Annie's report? Yes. Show me. Victor pulled up the audit entry. Elaine leaned closer. Facilities Administrator Account F3. Who owns it? It's a departmental credential. Elaine looked at him. Shared? Yes. How many people know the password? Victor hesitated. Several managers. Elaine's expression hardened. A shared administrator password on a safety reporting system? It's an older platform. That isn't an answer. Grant stepped closer to the screen. Can we tell which workstation accessed it? Victor opened another log. Workstation F12. Where is that? Facilities office, 27th floor. Grant looked at Elaine. So somebody in facilities opened Annie's report. At minimum, Elaine said, someone using a facilities administrator credential on a facilities workstation opened it. I'm not going to claim more until we preserve the data. Victor replied, which is exactly why we shouldn't jump to conclusions. Elaine looked at him. Victor, I'm the one telling everyone not to jump. You're the one explaining every problem before we've examined it. That stopped him. Elaine opened her folder and took out a yellow legal pad. Now, I want the sequence. Not Annie's sequence. The buildings. Grant understood immediately. Security calls, access panel, incident report, and the ambulance record, Elaine added. 4 systems that should leave separate traces. Victor said, the medical response isn't under facilities. Good, that means it gives us an independent clock. Grant picked up his phone. I can have my office request the emergency response time. Elaine nodded. Do that. We need the 911 call timestamp, paramedic arrival time, and the building access logs for the responding crew. Victor shifted again. This is becoming excessive for a door incident. Grant turned toward him. Stop calling it a door incident. Victor's face tightened. A man was taken to the hospital. Grant continued. An emergency line went unanswered, an access system failed, and the report describing both disappeared. The door is the least important part of this now. Annie looked down at her hands. Elaine noticed. Miss Carter, did you see any maintenance sticker or service notice on the access panel? Annie thought for a moment. There was a small sticker near the bottom. Do you remember the date? No, Ma'am. Anything about it? It looked old. Victor gave a short sigh. That's subjective. Annie glanced at him, then continued. The corner was peeling, and there was dust over part of it. I had to wipe the panel because I cleaned that wall. Elaine wrote it down. That's useful. Victor said. It could have been inspected yesterday and still had an old sticker. Elaine turned toward him. Then the maintenance record will show that. She looked at Grant. I want every work order involving that panel and that office door for the last 12 months. I also want every complaint involving emergency communications on that floor. Victor answered quickly. That could be hundreds of records across different maintenance categories. Then we'll have hundreds of records. Grant nodded. Pull them. Victor's voice became more cautious. Grant, we have the Meridian contract review in less than 48 hours. If we freeze facilities systems tonight, we risk delaying compliance documents they're expecting. Elaine looked at him. That contract is exactly why nothing gets altered. Victor's eyes moved to Grant. You know what's at stake. If outside reviewers hear we've opened an internal safety investigation right before certification, they may postpone the deal. Grant looked through the glass wall at the Chicago skyline. Snow was still coming down, whitening rooftops and blurring the red lights on nearby towers. A few hours earlier, The Meridian Agreement had been the most important thing on his calendar. Now an 18-year-old janitor was standing in his conference room with scraped knuckles because 3 systems had failed before she decided to break a 4th. He turned back. Preserve everything. Victor stared at him. Everything? Maintenance records, safety complaints, camera footage, call routing logs, administrator access, vendor communications. Nothing gets deleted under routine retention until Elaine clears it. That will create questions. Then we answer them. Victor lowered his voice. You may be protecting one employee at the expense of a company with thousands of people depending on it. Annie looked up at that, but Grant answered before she could react. I'm not protecting Annie from the facts. I'm protecting the facts from being changed. Elaine gave a small nod and closed her folder. That's the first correct decision anyone in this room has made tonight. Grant accepted the criticism without responding. Then he looked at Annie. You can go home after your hand is treated. You'll be paid for the full shift, and no disciplinary action moves forward until this review is complete. Annie hesitated. What happens if the report disappears again? Elaine answered this time. It won't. How do you know? Because from this moment forward, copies exist outside the system Victor's department controls. Victor stiffened at the wording. Elaine did not soften it. Annie gave a slow nod. As she reached the door, Grant called after her. Miss Carter. She turned. I should have asked what happened before I decided what I was looking at. Annie studied him for a moment. Yes, sir. There was no forgiveness in the answer, but there was no disrespect either. After she left, Elaine returned to the terminal and began filtering older records. 5 minutes later, she stopped scrolling. Grant. He came over. On the screen was another complaint from the same floor, filed 3 weeks earlier. Electronic access delay, intermittent failure, facilities notified. Status, closed. No repair notes, Elaine said. Victor stepped forward. That doesn't necessarily mean. Elaine scrolled again. A second complaint appeared. Then a third. Grant stared at the dates. The failed panel outside Harold Bennett's office had not become a problem tonight. It had been a problem for weeks, and someone had been closing the reports. By 7 the next morning, Elaine had stopped calling the missing reports an anomaly. She stood at the end of the conference table with a legal pad in one hand, while Grant worked through a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Victor had left twice to speak with his facilities staff, and returned each time with a little less confidence than before. Elaine turned the laptop so Grant could see the list. 14 access complaints in 11 months. Grant leaned closer. 14 from this building? 14 involving electronic locks. 6 more involving emergency communication failures, and 4 separate reports mentioning delayed or unanswered security response. Grant looked up. 24 incidents. Not necessarily 24 separate failures. Some may overlap, but that's not the part bothering me. She tapped the screen. Look at the status column. Grant read the entries one by one. Closed. Resolved. Closed. Resolved. Where are the repair notes? There aren't any on several of them. Victor pulled out a chair. That doesn't mean nothing was repaired. Some technicians close minor work verbally, if there's no replacement part involved. Elaine looked at him. Then, where are the technician names? Victor said nothing. And where are the labor entries? She continued. If someone physically checked a lock, there should be a time record. If a component was replaced, there should be a part number. If a vendor handled it, there should be an invoice. Victor leaned back. You're treating incomplete documentation like evidence of misconduct. I'm treating incomplete safety documentation like incomplete safety documentation. We'll decide what it means after we find out why it's incomplete. Grant scrolled farther down the list. One entry stopped him. Wait. Elaine followed his finger. 3 weeks earlier. 34th floor. Electronic access delay. Intermittent failure near executive accounting suite. Reported by A. Carter. Grant looked toward the door as if Annie might still be standing outside it. She reported that panel before. Elaine nodded. Or something close enough to it that we need to assume a connection until proven otherwise. Victor frowned. That could have been a temporary delay. The report says intermittent. Grant looked at him. Where's the repair record? Victor reached for the laptop. Let me see. Elaine pulled it slightly back. You can read it from there. Victor gave her a hard look, then scanned the entry. Facilities notified. Ticket closed 2 days later. By whom? He opened another field. Supervisor code J17. What work was performed? There's no description. Grant stared at him. You closed a safety-related access ticket without documenting the repair? I didn't personally close it. You run the department. Victor's tone hardened. And there are hundreds of maintenance tickets every week. You know that. Yes, Grant said, which is why I pay people to make sure they mean something when they're marked resolved. The room fell quiet. Elaine closed the laptop. I want Annie back in today, but not for another confrontation. I need a formal statement from her while the details are still fresh. Grant nodded. I'll have HR contact her. No. He looked at Elaine. She nearly got fired because HR and facilities records failed her in the same night. I don't want the first request coming through the same channels she has no reason to trust. Then who calls? You do. Grant hesitated. Victor gave a faint shake of his head. That seems unnecessary. Elaine turned toward him. So did listening to her before firing her, apparently. Grant picked up his phone. Annie answered on the fourth ring. Hello? Miss Carter, it's Grant Hollister. There was a pause long enough for him to realize how unusual that call must have sounded in her kitchen or bedroom. Yes, sir. I'm sorry to call so early. It's okay. I'm awake. He glanced at the clock. You should probably be asleep after last night. I tried. Grant heard the exhaustion in her voice. Elaine Morrow is here. She's conducting an independent review, and she'd like to take a formal statement from you today. You won't be disciplined for anything you say in that interview, and you'll be allowed to read the statement before you sign it. Annie was quiet again. Do I have to come in? No. Would it hurt me if I didn't? Grant looked at Elaine. Elaine shook her head. No, he said. It won't. Then why do you need me to do it? Grant could have answered with procedure. Instead, he said, because we found more reports. Annie's voice changed. About the door? About electronic locks, emergency communications, security response. How many? We're still counting. She said nothing. Grant continued. We also found a complaint from you 3 weeks ago. I told my supervisor that panel was acting strange. You remember it? Yes. It took forever to recognize a badge. Then the screen froze. He said facilities already knew. Grant looked at Victor. Did anyone ever follow up with you? No. Did anyone tell you it had been repaired? No. Grant's jaw tightened. Annie spoke more quietly. Mr. Hollister, I already told everybody what happened last night. I know. I told security. Then I wrote it down. Then I explained it again upstairs. Now somebody else wants me to say it again. Grant did not interrupt. Her voice became strained. Every time I tell it, somebody changes the words. I say I opened the panel because the emergency button failed. And the report says I tampered with security equipment. I say I broke the door because Miss Bennett stopped answering, and somebody writes forced entry. Elaine held out her hand for the phone. Grant passed it to her. Annie, this is Elaine Morrow. Yes, ma'am. I understand why you don't want to repeat yourself. I'm tired of proving I wasn't trying to do something bad. You shouldn't have to prove the same truth 5 different ways just because the people recording it have more authority than you do. Annie was silent. Elaine continued. If you come in, you'll sit with me, not Victor, not your supervisor. I'll write what you say. Then you'll read every line before it becomes part of the record. If something is wrong, we correct it before you sign. And if I don't like how something is worded, then you don't sign it. Annie exhaled slowly. Elaine added, justice isn't fair if only the people with power can afford to wait for it. Another pause. What time do you want me there? After you've eaten and slept. I can come at noon. Noon is fine. When the call ended, Grant looked at Elaine. You think she trusts us? No. The answer came without hesitation. Grant frowned. Elaine put the phone on the table. Trust isn't owed because you corrected one mistake. It has to survive what happens next. Victor pushed his chair back. And what exactly happens next? Elaine reopened the maintenance database. We find out why 14 complaints were closed without enough evidence that anything was fixed. She filtered the records by administrator access. Several entries appeared under the same facility's credential. Grant stared at the screen. The first missing report had looked like a mistake. 14 did not. At noon, Annie returned to Sterling North Tower, wearing the same navy work jacket over a gray sweatshirt. She had slept less than 3 hours. Elaine met her in a smaller conference room away from facilities, where a pot of coffee, bottled water, and a yellow legal pad waited on the table. You don't have to remember every minute perfectly, Elaine told her. Just tell me what you remember, and if I write something that doesn't sound like what you meant, stop me. Annie sat across from her. You really mean that? I do. Grant remained near the window instead of joining them at the table. He had asked Annie if she wanted him there, and she had shrugged. You can stay. You were there when they tried to fire me. Grant had not corrected the wording. The interview lasted 40 minutes. Annie read the statement twice before signing it. When she finished, Elaine placed it in a separate file rather than the company's internal system. Annie noticed, You're not uploading it? Not yet. I want an independent copy first. That makes me feel better. Grant glanced at her. It probably shouldn't. Annie looked confused. It means we don't trust our own records right now. Before she could answer, Elaine's phone buzzed. She checked the message, then turned her laptop toward Grant. I found something you need to see. The file was from 6 months earlier. A maintenance technician named Michael Reeves had opened an electronic access panel on the 22nd floor after a lock stopped responding. Grant read the summary aloud. Employee removed panel cover and performed manual troubleshooting until access was restored. Elaine opened a second document. It was Annie's preliminary security report from the night before. Grant read more slowly this time. Employee engaged in aggressive tampering with restricted security equipment before forcing entry into an executive office. Annie's eyes moved from one document to the other. Grant looked at Elaine. What exactly did Reeves do? According to the attached work note, he used a screwdriver to remove the cover, pressed the internal reset, and manually manipulated the latch. Annie leaned forward. That's what I did. Victor, who had just entered the room carrying a folder, heard her. No, it isn't. Grant turned. What's the difference? Reeves is a trained building technician. Miss Carter is a janitor. Annie looked down for a second, then back up. The panel didn't know what my job title was. Victor's mouth tightened. This isn't personal. It's about training and authorization. Elaine remained calm. Then the report should say she was unauthorized. Why does one employee get manual troubleshooting while Annie gets aggressive tampering? Because the circumstances were different. Grant pointed at the two documents. Were they? Victor set down his folder. Michael Reeves was responding to a work order. Annie made a decision on her own. There was a man calling for help behind the door, Grant said. That doesn't mean we rewrite policy because the outcome happened to be favorable. Annie's posture changed. Happened to be favorable? Victor looked at her. Mr. Bennett survived. We're all grateful for that. But companies can't run on employees deciding when rules apply. Annie's voice stayed low, though Grant could hear the anger beneath it. I didn't decide the rules didn't apply. I tried the rules first. I called security 3 times. I used the emergency panel. Nothing worked. Victor replied. And you still had other options. What options? You could have waited for security personnel to arrive. Annie stared at him. How long? Victor paused. How long was I supposed to wait while he stopped answering? That isn't the point. It was the whole point to me. Grant looked between them. Victor. Answer her question. Victor's eyes shifted toward him. There is no fixed time. So when she waited, called 3 times, and tried the emergency system, at what exact point would you have considered it acceptable for her to act? I'm saying she lacked the authority to determine that. Elaine closed the laptop halfway. That's the problem with the way this report is written. It doesn't describe the emergency. It describes Annie as the emergency. Victor gave her a hard look. You're making this something it isn't. Emmy? Yes. You're starting to suggest bias where there may simply be differences in qualification. Grant reopened the laptop and looked again at the phrases. Manual troubleshooting. Aggressive tampering. He had spent years reading incident summaries without questioning how much judgment could be hidden inside ordinary words. Who wrote Annie's preliminary report? He asked. Victor hesitated. Security drafted it based on the footage. Who reviewed it? My office. And nobody thought it was important to include that she had called security 3 times? That information wasn't verified at the time. It is verified now. Yes. Did anyone revise the report? Not yet. Grant turned to Annie. When you first saw that wording, what did you think? She hesitated. You can answer honestly. I thought if anybody ever read it later, they'd think I was dangerous. Victor sighed. Nobody called you dangerous. You didn't have to. The room went quiet. Elaine looked at Grant. Bias doesn't always show up as an insult. Sometimes it shows up in which person gets described as resourceful and which person gets described as aggressive. Victor shook his head. That's an interpretation, Grant replied. So are both of these reports. No one spoke for several seconds. Grant finally closed the laptop. From now on, every incident report connected to this investigation gets reviewed for factual language. No loaded descriptions. No assumptions about motive. Victor's expression hardened. You're changing reporting standards because one employee complained. No, Grant said. I'm changing them because I almost fired someone based on words that told me what to think before they told me what happened. Annie looked at him, but before she could respond, Elaine's phone rang. She listened for a moment, then covered the receiver. It's Harold Bennett. Grant straightened. He's awake? Awake enough to talk, and he asked specifically about Annie. Annie's face changed. Elaine switched the call to speaker. A weak older man's voice came through. Is the young lady who found me there? Annie leaned toward the phone. Mr. Bennett? There was a pause, followed by a tired breath. Annie. I'm told they're calling what you did a break-in. She glanced at Grant. Harold continued. That's not what happened. His voice was weak, but the words were clear. You didn't break into my office, young lady. Another breath. You broke me out of it. Harold's words stayed in the room after the call ended. Annie lowered her eyes toward the table, embarrassed by the attention more than moved by it, while Grant kept looking at the speakerphone as if Harold had said something larger than a thank you. Elaine was the first to speak. He sounds tired. We shouldn't keep him on the phone any longer than necessary. I agree, Grant said, then leaned closer to the speaker. Harold, get some rest. We can talk when you're stronger. Actually, Grant, there's one thing you need to hear before I do that. Grant exchanged a glance with Elaine. What is it? Harold took a slow breath. I wasn't staying late for fun. I was checking the maintenance accounts. Victor, who had been standing near the end of the table, looked up. What maintenance accounts? The building service expenses, emergency systems, access controls, replacement parts. A few numbers didn't make sense. Victor's tone remained controlled. Harold, you're in the hospital after a cardiac event. This can wait until you're back. No, Victor, it waited long enough. Grant straightened. Tell me what you found. There were months when maintenance spending went up, but the number of completed work orders went down. That usually happens during a major replacement cycle. But I couldn't find one. Elaine pulled her legal pad closer. How large was the difference? I didn't finish the review. Maybe 6 figures over several quarters, possibly more. I was trying to match invoices against actual repairs when I got sick. Grant glanced at Victor. Were there any major system replacements this year? Several smaller projects, Victor replied. Door controls, communications, hardware, preventive maintenance. Nothing unusual for a building this size. Harold gave a tired laugh through the speaker. Then somebody should be able to show where the equipment went. The room grew quiet. Elaine asked, do you remember which vendors you were reviewing? I sent myself a spreadsheet before I left the office. Grant, have someone get it from my company account. Don't let facilities edit anything first. Victor's expression tightened. That's unnecessary. Harold answered before Grant could. Then it should be easy to prove I'm wrong. Grant picked up his phone. Elaine will secure a copy directly from IT. Good. Harold's voice weakened. And Annie? She leaned closer. I'm here. Don't let anybody convince you that breaking that door was the worst thing that happened in that hallway. Annie swallowed. Yes, sir. Harold, Elaine said gently. That's enough for today. He agreed, and the call ended. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Grant turned to Victor. You said the complaints were probably documentation gaps. I said incomplete records don't automatically prove misconduct. Now I have a senior accountant telling me maintenance spending increased while completed repairs decreased. Victor leaned one hand against the table. That happens. Parts costs rise. Emergency service contracts change. Vendors charge more. Elaine looked at him. Then the invoices and the equipment should match. They will. Grant closed the laptop. Let's find out. Victor frowned. Right now? Yes. 20 minutes later. Grant, Elaine, Victor, and a building engineer named Sam Rourke stood in the service level beneath the executive floors. Annie had been told she could leave, but she remained long enough to identify the type of access panel that had failed outside Harold's office. The service corridor was nothing like the polished lobby upstairs. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling, the concrete floor carried years of cart marks, and metal cabinets were labeled with faded stickers and handwritten dates. Sam opened a locked cabinet containing spare access control components. Grant pointed toward a row of boxed modules. If one of the panels upstairs was replaced, there should be a record tied to one of these. Yes, sir. Every unit has a serial number. Elaine handed Sam a printed work order. This says the 34th floor controller was replaced 4 months ago. Sam read it twice. Then the unit installed upstairs should have a newer serial number. Victor crossed his arms, assuming the work order refers to the same controller. Elaine nodded. That's why we're checking. They returned to the 34th floor. Annie stood nearby with her cleaning cart, waiting to begin her next section. When she saw them, she pointed toward the panel. That's the one. Sam removed the cover carefully and read the serial number inside. He paused. Grant noticed immediately. What? Sam checked the work order again. This unit wasn't installed 4 months ago. Victor stepped closer. How can you tell? The serial number dates it to the original equipment batch. Grant stared at him. Original as in when? About 7 years ago. Elaine looked at the invoice. The company paid for a replacement controller in March. Sam nodded slowly. Then whatever they replaced, it wasn't this. Victor's voice hardened. There may have been a clerical error in the location code. Elaine handed him the page. Same floor, same office suite, same panel designation. Grant bent closer to the open unit. A maintenance sticker was fixed near the lower edge, its corner peeling away exactly as Annie had described. Sam, when was this last physically inspected? Sam studied the sticker. According to this, almost 9 months ago. Victor shook his head. The electronic record shows more recent service. That's the problem, Grant said. Victor looked at him. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything yet. Grant straightened and looked down the hallway. Annie was standing a few yards away, one hand resting on her cart. Miss Carter, when you reported this panel 3 weeks ago, did anyone ever come while you were working? Not that I saw. Did anyone ask you whether it was fixed? No. Grant looked at Victor. A report says it was repaired. An invoice says a controller was replaced. The controller is 7 years old, and the employee who reported the problem never saw anyone come back. Victor's face remained composed, but he took longer to answer. Then we traced the work order. Elaine nodded. That's exactly what we're going to do. Grant ran his thumb across the old inspection sticker. Years earlier, he had trusted physical work because someone had to stand in front of the thing that was broken and make it function again. Somewhere along the way, numbers on screens had become easier to believe. He looked at Sam. I want every replacement listed in these maintenance accounts physically verified, not just checked against another spreadsheet. Someone goes to the equipment and reads the serial number. Victor stared at him. That could take days. Then it takes days. Elaine's phone vibrated. She read the message and looked up. It recovered Harold's spreadsheet. Grant asked, anything useful? More than useful. There are 3 vendors receiving recurring payments for access control maintenance. Victor's face changed almost imperceptibly. Elaine continued. One of them has been paid every month for the last 11 months. Grant looked at the old controller still sitting inside the wall, for work that apparently wasn't done. No one answered him, and for the first time, the broken door no longer looked like the center of the problem. The first clip appeared online before lunch. Elaine saw it on her phone while she was still reviewing Harold's spreadsheet. She watched the 20-second video once, then again without sound. Annie appeared in the hallway exactly as she had on the original security footage. She stopped beside the office, removed a screwdriver from her cleaning cart, opened the access panel, then returned with the pry bar and forced the door. Nothing before that moment appeared. No unanswered calls, no failed emergency request, no weak voice from inside the office. Elaine stood and walked straight into Grant's office. We have a problem. Grant looked up from the vendor invoices spread across his desk. What happened? She placed the phone in front of him. He watched the clip. At the bottom of the screen, the headline read, Night Janitor Breaks into Executive Office at Billionaire's Chicago Tower. Grant's expression hardened. Where did this come from? We don't know yet. It was posted less than 30 minutes ago, and several local accounts have already picked it up. Victor, who had been standing near the window, came over and watched the video. At least the footage itself is authentic. Grant turned toward him. That's what concerns you? I'm saying we shouldn't accuse anyone of fabricating evidence. She did exactly what the video shows. Elaine looked at him, and once again, the video starts after everything that explains why she did it. Victor spread his hands. That doesn't make the footage false. No, Grant said. It makes the person who released it selective. His phone buzzed before anyone could answer. Then, Elaine's did the same. Grant checked the screen. Another clip had appeared. This one was shorter. The conference room from the night of the incident. Grant stood across from Annie while Victor remained beside the security monitor. There was no beginning and no context. Only Grant's voice. Turn in your badge. You're fired. The clip ended. Grant stared at the screen. Elaine let out a slow breath. That one came from inside this floor. Victor's expression shifted. There are cameras in several executive areas. Not with audio like that, Elaine replied. Grant looked at him. Who had access to the room recording? I'd have to check. Then check it now. Victor's jaw tightened. You're looking at me like I leaked it. I'm looking at the man responsible for the systems both clips came from. That's not proof. No, it isn't. Grant turned back to Elaine. What are people saying? She hesitated. Tell me. Elaine scrolled through the posts. Some are calling Annie a trespasser. Others are asking why a 50-year-old billionaire fired an 18-year-old black employee before hearing her explanation. A few outlets have already requested comment. Grant sat back in his chair. Victor said, Then we need to get ahead of this. Release the full footage, the call records, and the medical timeline. Once people see the entire sequence, the story changes. Elaine looked at Grant. That would include the audio Annie gave us and details about Harold's medical emergency. We can redact some of it. We can redact names, Elaine said. But the full clip would still make Annie the center of a public spectacle she never agreed to. Victor's voice sharpened. Her reputation is being attacked right now. So is Grant's. Doing nothing has a cost. Grant looked toward Elaine. Call Annie. Elena did. Annie answered after several rings. Her voice sounded guarded. Hello? Annie, it's Elaine. Are you somewhere private? I'm at home. Have you been online today? There was a pause. My cousin sent me something. Elaine looked at Grant. Annie continued. It's the video, isn't it? Yes. I didn't give it to anybody. We know. Another pause. People are saying I broke in to steal something. Grant closed his eyes for a moment. Elaine said, We have the option to release more of the footage and the phone evidence. It would show why you were trying to get inside. Annie did not answer immediately. Then she asked, Would they hear Mr. Bennett? They might. And see everything I was doing? Some of it, yes. Would my name be everywhere? It already is in some places. Annie breathed out slowly. I don't want more of me out there. Victor, standing several feet away, shook his head and whispered, This is a mistake. Grant heard him. Elaine asked Annie, You're saying you do not want us to release the full recording? No. Mr. Bennett was sick. That shouldn't be on the internet just because people think I'm lying. Grant stepped closer to the phone. Annie. This is Grant. I know. If we don't release it, people may keep believing the shorter version. I understand. You may get more calls, more comments, maybe reporters outside your building. I understand that too. Grant looked at Elaine before asking, Are you sure? Annie's reply came quietly but without hesitation. Yes. I don't want somebody else's worst moment used to clean up my name. Grant said nothing for several seconds. Victor finally spoke louder. Grant, with respect. This is no longer just her decision. Sterling North has clients, employees, and a major contract under review. Annie heard him through the phone. Her voice changed. Is Mr. Hale there? Grant looked toward Victor. Yes. Then please tell him I'm sorry the truth is inconvenient. Victor's face hardened. Grant almost responded, but Annie continued. I'm not trying to hurt the company. I just don't want you fixing one unfair thing by doing another. Grant's expression softened. All right. Victor stepped forward. Grant raised a hand. Then he spoke into the phone. We won't release it. Annie was silent. You're sure? Yes. Thank you. After the call ended, Victor stared at him. You just gave up the fastest way to stop this. No, Grant said. I gave up the fastest way to protect myself. That distinction may cost us the Meridian contract. Then we deal with that when it happens. Victor turned away, frustrated. Elaine's phone rang again. She answered, listened, then looked toward Grant. What now? He asked. Meridian's compliance team wants an emergency call this afternoon. Victor gave a bitter laugh. There it is. Grant looked once more at the two clips spreading across the screen. For the first time since the investigation began, the problem was no longer contained inside Sterling North Tower. Someone had taken 20 seconds of truth, cut away everything that gave it meaning, and handed the rest to the world. The emergency call with Meridian lasted 23 minutes, and by the time it ended, Grant understood that the contract was no longer simply about price, staffing, or performance. The voice on the speaker belonged to Daniel Mercer, Meridian's chief compliance officer. He did not raise his voice once. Grant, we need to be clear about what we're evaluating now. We saw the footage. We also saw your termination statement. Grant sat at the head of the conference table while Elaine remained to his right. Victor sat across from them. The footage is incomplete, Grant said. The employee was responding to a medical emergency. That may be true, but the issue for us is broader. We're being asked to place a large portfolio under Sterling North's management. If there are questions about emergency response, access systems, or internal reporting, we need to know whether this is one isolated event or something structural. Grant glanced toward Elaine. We've opened an independent review. Victor leaned toward the speaker. And at this point, Daniel, there is no evidence of a company-wide safety failure. We have one employee who acted outside policy, a security contractor that may have missed calls, and a faulty access panel. Elaine's eyes moved to him. Daniel Mercer paused. Victor, you just described 3 separate failures in one incident. Victor's expression tightened. Daniel continued. Meridian is not canceling anything today, but we are postponing final approval until we receive a written explanation of what happened and what controls are in place. Grant asked, for how long? That depends on what your review finds. The call ended shortly afterward. Victor pushed his chair back. This is exactly what I warned about. The longer we expand the investigation, the more reasons we give them to walk away. Elaine closed her notebook. You think the investigation is creating the problem? I think we need to distinguish between a fixable operational failure and a scandal. Grant looked at him. And how do you suggest we do that? Victor had clearly prepared the answer. We issue a factual statement. Annie Carter entered a restricted office without authorization during an emergency. We acknowledge that the contracted security desk failed to respond. We discipline the contractor, replace the panel, and close the matter. Elaine stared at him. And the deleted report? We're still determining whether it was deleted intentionally. The older complaints? Documentation gaps. The controller Sterling North paid to replace but never received? Victor's voice cooled. One mismatched serial number. Grant leaned back. Victor continued. You're risking a 9-figure agreement over questions that may have ordinary explanations. Grant looked at the frozen frame on the wall monitor, still showing Annie beside the damaged door. And if they don't? Victor did not answer. Later that afternoon, Elaine called Grant from the hallway outside his office. Annie hasn't returned my last 2 calls. Did she quit? Not officially. Where is she? I think I know. 30 minutes later, Grant stepped into a small diner on the south side, several miles from Sterling North Tower. There were vinyl booths, a counter lined with chrome stools, and a coffee machine that looked older than Annie. A bear's pennant hung crooked above the kitchen window. Annie sat alone in a booth near the back with a mug between her hands. A folded sheet of paper lay beside it. Grant stopped across from her. May I sit? She looked surprised to see him. How did you find me? Elaine said you mentioned this place during your interview. Annie looked toward the front counter. I didn't think she'd send the CEO. She didn't. She told me you weren't answering. Annie hesitated, then nodded toward the opposite seat. Grant sat. A waitress in her 60s came over with a coffee pot. You want some? Yes, please. She filled a mug without asking who he was. Then she looked at Annie. You eat anything? I'm not hungry. The woman frowned. That's not what I asked. Annie almost smiled. Toast, maybe. Good. You're getting eggs, too. After she walked away, Grant looked at the folded paper. Is that a resignation letter? Annie covered it with one hand. I haven't turned it in. Why write it? Because I don't know what else to do. Grant did not interrupt. Annie stared into her coffee. Yesterday, nobody knew my name. Now people I've never met are arguing about whether I'm a criminal or some kind of hero. I don't want to be either one. You saved Harold's life. I opened a door. You did more than that. She shook her head. That's what everyone keeps doing. They take something I did and make it bigger until it doesn't feel like mine anymore. Grant took that in. Annie continued. Mr. Bennett needed help. I helped him. I thought that would be the end of it. I understand. She looked at him. Do you? Grant stopped. No, he admitted. Probably not the way you do. The waitress returned with toast, 2 eggs, and hash browns. She set the plate down in front of Annie. You don't have to finish it. You do have to start. Annie nodded. Thanks, Miss Carroll. Carroll looked at Grant. You treating her right? The question caught him off guard. I'm trying to. Try harder. She walked away before he could answer. Annie gave the smallest laugh. Grant looked at the resignation letter again. Elaine needs your cooperation because some of the records we're finding don't make sense. I already gave a statement. I know, and I don't want to keep sitting in rooms with lawyers while people ask me the same questions. I know that too. Annie picked up a piece of toast but did not eat it. Then why are you here? Because the investigation is getting bigger. We found more maintenance complaints. There are questions about work orders, repairs, and vendor payments. Her face changed. So this isn't about me anymore. It started with what happened to you. It may involve a lot more. Annie looked toward the window, where traffic moved through gray winter slush. What happens if I say I'm done? Grant answered carefully. You're allowed to be done. Would that stop the investigation? No. She turned back toward him. Even if I refuse another interview? Yes. Even if I quit? Yes. Annie studied him for several seconds. Why? Grant wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. Because if your report disappeared, that's not your problem to carry. If maintenance records were changed, that's not your problem either. Those belong to the company, which means they belong to me. She looked down at the folded resignation letter. So if I walk away, you'll still keep looking? Yes. Her voice became quieter. Even if it costs you that big contract? Grant did not answer immediately. Then he said, I'm beginning to think the more important question is what it costs if I stop. Annie finally took a bite of toast. The resignation letter stayed folded beside her plate. For now, she left it unsigned. By the time Grant returned to Sterling North, Elaine had already asked Harold's accounting team to pull the vendor files tied to access control maintenance. The first 2 companies looked ordinary. Established contractors, clear addresses, insurance certificates, service records that could be matched to work orders. The third one did not. Elaine had the file open when Grant walked into the conference room. How did it go with Annie? She hasn't resigned. That's something. She also made it very clear she doesn't want to become the face of whatever this turns into. Elaine nodded. Good. Then we make sure she doesn't. Grant took off his coat and looked at the screen. What did you find? Elaine rotated the laptop toward him. Hale Building Systems, LLC. They've received recurring payments for access control maintenance every month for 11 months. Grant read the total at the bottom. That much for one building? Not one building. They've billed across 3 Sterling North properties. But most of the charges here are labeled emergency access maintenance, controller replacement, and preventive service. Victor entered just as Grant asked, who approved them? Elaine answered without looking away from the screen. Facilities. Victor pulled out a chair. They're a subcontractor. That isn't unusual. Grant looked at him. Do you know the company? I know the name. Who brought them in? My department uses several secondary vendors when the primary contractor is unavailable. Elaine opened another document. Their registered office is a mailbox at a commercial shipping center in Oak Park. Victor shrugged. A lot of small contractors use mailing addresses. They have no listed service yard, no fleet registration under the company name, and only one employee tied to state filings. Victor's expression changed slightly. Then maybe they subcontract their field work. Elaine clicked again. That one employee is Daniel Hale. Silence settled over the room. Grant looked at Victor. Relative? Victor's jaw tightened. My sister's son. Grant stared at him. Your nephew? Yes. And your department has been approving payments to his company? Victor leaned back. He runs a legitimate business. Elaine asked, "Did you disclose the relationship?" "It was known." "To whom?" "Procurement." Elaine looked at Grant. "I've checked the conflict of interest register. There's no disclosure." Victor's voice hardened. "Then someone failed to upload it." Grant almost laughed, but there was no humor in him. "Another record that somehow isn't there." Victor looked at him. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Decide I'm guilty because the documentation is incomplete. You were angry at Annie for exactly that." Grant went still. Victor had meant it as a defense, but the words landed differently. Grant nodded once. "You're right about one thing. I'm not going to decide anything before we verify it." Victor relaxed slightly. Grant continued, "So we verify everything." Elaine slid a printed invoice across the table. "Start here. March 17th. Replacement of access controller. 34th floor executive accounting suite." Grant looked at the amount. "The controller we physically checked yesterday." "Yes." "The one that's 7 years old." "Yes." Victor reached for the page. "That could be a location, coding error." Elaine handed him another invoice. "Then explain this one." "Same date, same technician initials, same 4-hour labor block, at another property, 8 miles away." Victor looked at the paper longer this time. Grant asked, "Can one technician bill 4 hours in 2 buildings at the same time?" "No. So either the invoices are wrong or the work is." Victor set both pages down. "I'll call Daniel." Elaine stopped him. "No." Victor looked at her. "Excuse me? You don't contact any vendor connected to this review until outside counsel approves it." "That's my nephew." "Exactly." Victor pushed back from the table. "You're treating me like I'm under investigation." Elaine's voice remained calm. "At this point, everyone who had authority over those records is part of the investigation." Grant watched Victor closely. "Sit down." Victor did, but not willingly. Elaine opened Harold's spreadsheet next. "There's more." Harold flagged a pattern. Maintenance costs rose 23% over the same period that completed work orders fell. Victor shook his head. "Parts costs increased." "Everyone in commercial property knows that." "Then where are the parts?" Victor looked at her. Elaine continued. "We've physically checked 5 controllers listed as replaced. 4 are still original equipment." Grant's expression hardened. 4 out of 5? "Yes." Victor leaned forward. "You're moving too fast. Maybe the replacements were internal components, not full controllers." Elaine slid the work orders toward him. "Then whoever wrote these documents chose the wrong words repeatedly." Grant stood and walked to the window. Down below, people crossed the sidewalks with shoulders hunched against the wind, unaware that several floors above them, a line item in a spreadsheet was beginning to look like theft. He turned back. "How much have we paid Hale Building Systems?" Elaine gave him the number. Grant looked at Victor again. "And how much of the work can we verify?" "So far," Elaine said, "very little." Victor stood. "I want counsel present before I answer anything else." Grant nodded. "That's reasonable." Victor seemed surprised. Grant continued. "But before you leave, answer one question. When Annie reported that panel 3 weeks before Harold collapsed, did your department know the controller had already been billed as replaced?" Victor's face changed. "I'd have to check." Grant stepped closer. "That wasn't a complicated question. I said I'd have to check." Elaine watched him leave, then waited until the door shut. Grant spoke first. "He knew." Elaine looked at him. "Maybe. But we prove it." A knock came at the door. Sam Rourke, the building engineer, entered carrying a tablet. "Mr. Hollister, you asked us to verify the emergency call system too." Grant nodded. "What did you find?" Sam hesitated. "The calls from Annie's phone definitely reached the main security console." "We know that. There's more. The desk was unstaffed for 27 minutes. Grant's expression darkened. Sam continued. "And according to the contractor's schedule, 2 guards were supposed to be covering that period." "Were there 2? "No, sir. There was 1. Elaine looked up. "But Sterling North was billed for 2? Sam nodded. Grant stared at the vendor invoices on the table, then at the security staffing report. A failed door, missing repairs, unanswered calls. Staff that existed on paper but not at the desk. The pattern was no longer difficult to see. Grant said quietly, "Someone has been charging us for safety we never actually had." The board meeting began at 4:30 that afternoon, and for the first 10 minutes no one mentioned Annie Carter's name. They talked about Meridian instead. One director asked how long the contract delay might last. Another wanted to know whether the maintenance findings could trigger additional reviews at other Sterling North properties. A third asked Elaine whether the company had any legal duty to notify clients before the internal investigation was complete. Grant listened until Victor finally pushed a folder toward the center of the table. "There is a way to contain this," Victor said. Elaine looked at him. "Contain what?" "Exactly. The operational failure, the media issue, the Meridian exposure, all of it." Grant leaned back. "Go on." Victor opened the folder. "We have an employee who entered a restricted office without authorization and damaged a security system. We have a contracted security desk that failed to answer calls. We have documentation problems in facilities. Those are serious, but they do not automatically amount to a company-wide scandal." One of the directors, Richard Cole, nodded. "That sounds reasonable." Elaine's expression did not change. "You left out the false maintenance invoices. They're under review. The missing controller replacements, also under review. The deleted incident report?" Victor looked at her. "We still don't know who deleted it." Grant folded his hands. "So what are you proposing?" Victor took a breath. "We terminate Annie for the policy violation, not for the medical outcome. We negotiate a settlement that protects her from a damaging personnel record. We place responsibility for the unanswered calls on the security contractor, suspend the facility supervisor who approved the questionable work orders, and continue an internal review without expanding it unnecessarily." Grant stared at him. "You want to fire her now?" "I want to separate her conduct from everything discovered afterward. She broke a door because Harold was on the floor. And she still broke the door." Elaine looked at Victor. "You understand how that sounds after everything we've verified?" "I understand exactly how it sounds. I also understand how companies survive investigations. You deal with the facts you can prove and avoid turning every problem into a moral crusade." Richard Cole cleared his throat. "Grant, we need to be practical. Meridian is watching. If this turns into a broad compliance investigation, we could lose the entire deal." Another director, Susan Wade, added, "And once one client requests a portfolio-wide audit, others may follow. We have thousands of employees whose jobs depend on this company remaining stable." Grant looked around the table. "And Annie's job?" Susan hesitated. "She's 18. If the settlement is fair, she'll find another job." The room went quiet. Grant's eyes stayed on her. "That's your argument?" "I'm saying we have to weigh one employee against the larger organization." Elaine closed her notebook. "That is exactly how people become expendable on paper." Victor turned toward Grant. "Nobody is calling her expendable. You just built an entire plan around making her disappear." "I built a plan around protecting Sterling North." Grant's jaw tightened. Victor leaned forward. "You don't have to protect me. If facilities made mistakes, investigate them. If someone falsified invoices, remove them. But protect the company." He lowered his voice. "All you have to say is that Annie violated policy." Grant looked at him. Victor continued. "That statement is true." That was the part Grant hated most. It was true. Annie had touched a restricted panel. She had forced a door. She had acted without authorization. None of those facts required anyone to mention the unanswered calls, Harold's voice, or the system that had failed before she picked up the pry bar. Grant stood. "I'm done for today." Richard frowned. "We haven't voted. We're not voting on whether to make an 18-year-old employee carry this for us." Victor's expression hardened. "Then, you'd better be prepared for what comes next." Grant looked at him. "I am." But later that evening, alone in his office, he was less certain. The security footage played silently across one monitor, while Annie's audio file sat open on another. He watched her remove the panel cover. He watched her force the door. Then he pressed play on the recording. The crash came first. Then Harold's weak voice. "Help, somebody." Grant stopped the video. He understood now how easy it would be to tell the wrong story without technically lying. His phone rang. "Elaine." "Grant, there's something else." "What happened?" Annie was approached by outside counsel representing several board interests. They offered her a settlement. Grant stood immediately. Without telling us? They didn't need our permission to make the offer. What are the terms? Resignation, confidentiality agreement, waiver of claims, and a clean final employment record. Grant stared at the city beyond the glass. How much? Elaine told him. It was enough money to change an 18-year-old's life for a while. Did she sign? Not yet. Where is she? With her mother. Elaine paused. She asked for time. Grant closed his eyes. For Annie, the offer was not abstract. It could cover tuition, help with rent, give her a way out of night work. More importantly, it could make the attention stop. An hour later, Elaine called again. She refused it. Grant sat forward. She refused the money? Yes. Why? Elaine was silent for a moment. She said if she signed, the company could call what happened an employee problem and move on. Grant looked at the frozen image on his monitor. Elaine continued. She also said something else. What? She said, that night I could have stood outside the door and told myself it wasn't my responsibility. I don't want to do the same thing now. Grant said nothing. After the call ended, he opened the board packet again. The Meridian contract projections filled half the first page. Revenue, expansion, employment growth, numbers large enough to make almost any argument sound responsible. Then he looked at the maintenance approvals bearing his own electronic signature. He had praised Victor's department for reducing operating costs. He had approved budgets. He had accepted reports showing lower expenses without asking how the savings had been achieved. Maybe he had not known, but he had benefited from not knowing. The next morning, Elaine entered his office carrying 2 folders. One is the limited internal response the board wants, and the other, full disclosure. Maintenance records, security failures, vendor irregularities, deleted reports, all of it. Once this leaves the building, you don't control what happens next. Grant looked at both folders. What does legal recommend? Elaine gave him a tired smile. Legal recommends knowing exactly which risk you're willing to live with. Grant picked up the second folder. Notify Meridian. Notify outside counsel. Preserve everything and prepare the appropriate regulatory disclosures. Elaine watched him. You understand this could cost you the contract. Yes, and possibly your position. Grant looked once more at the paused footage of Annie at the door. Then he closed the laptop. Send everything. The independent review began 2 days later in a conference room that had been stripped of everything unnecessary. No company logos on the walls, no presentation screens looping Sterling North branding, no assistants coming in with coffee every 10 minutes. Outside counsel sat at one end of the table, 2 compliance auditors at the other. Elaine was beside Annie. Grant sat across from Victor, while Harold Bennett, still pale and moving carefully, had been given a chair near the door so he could leave if he became tired. Annie had asked twice whether she was required to attend. Elaine had told her the truth. No. But if you choose to be here, nobody gets to summarize your decision for you. That was why Annie had come. Victor's attorney began with the security footage. The lights dimmed slightly, and the same image Annie had seen too many times appeared on the screen. Her standing outside Harold's office, with a screwdriver in one hand. The video showed her removing the access panel cover, reaching inside, then returning with the pry bar and forcing the door. Victor's attorney let the clip finish before speaking. Ms. Carter, I want to keep this simple. Is that you in the video? Yes. You removed the cover from a restricted access control panel? Yes. And you did not have authorization to open that panel? No, I didn't. You then used a metal tool to force entry into Mr. Bennett's office. Annie glanced at Elaine, but Elaine did not answer for her. Yes. So you understood at the time that you were violating company policy. Annie took a breath. I understood I wasn't supposed to open the panel or break the door. The attorney nodded. Thank you. That's all I asked. Victor shifted slightly in his chair. Grant watched Annie's face. She had gone pale, but her hands remained flat on the table. The attorney continued. And there were other options available to you, weren't there? Annie looked at him. I tried the options I knew. That wasn't my question. You could have waited for security. I did wait. You could have called security. I called 3 times. You could have used the emergency access system. I did. The attorney paused. Annie continued before he could move on. It showed system error. He looked down at his notes. You are not trained in access control systems, correct? No. So you couldn't know whether the panel had actually failed. Annie's voice became tighter. I knew it didn't open the door, and I knew nobody answered. That still doesn't establish that the system was completely inoperable. Grant saw Elaine's hand move slightly on the table, a signal for Annie not to rush. Annie nodded once. Maybe not completely. It was inoperable enough that a man was inside asking for help, and I still couldn't get to him. Victor's attorney leaned back. Miss Carter, this room is not here to judge your intentions. We are trying to determine whether procedures were followed. Annie looked directly at him. Then no, they weren't. The attorney seemed satisfied until she continued. Because the procedures weren't answering. The room went still. Grant lowered his eyes for a moment. The attorney's expression tightened. What exactly do you mean by that? Annie folded her hands together. I mean, I did what the building told me to do. I called security. Nobody answered. I used the emergency panel. It failed. I called again. Nobody answered. Mr. Bennett got quieter, and then he stopped answering me through the door. Her voice shook slightly, but she kept going. So yes, I broke the rule. I knew I was breaking it. I also knew there was a person on the other side who might not have time for me to stand there and keep following a process that wasn't working. Victor's attorney opened his mouth, but Annie raised her hand slightly. I'm not trying to sound brave. I was scared. I thought I was going to lose my job, and for a few seconds I almost did nothing because of that. She looked toward Grant. He did not look away. Then I heard Mr. Bennett again. Harold shifted in his chair. Annie continued. I had a choice. I could protect the door, or I could try to protect the man behind it. She swallowed. I chose the man. No one spoke. Harold was the one who broke the silence. Can I say something? Outside counsel looked toward him. Mr. Bennett, if you feel well enough. Harold adjusted himself carefully in the chair. I've listened to people talk about that door for 2 days as if it were the victim. Victor's attorney turned. No one is saying that. Harold looked at him. Maybe not with those words. He rested one hand over the front of his cardigan. I remember lying on the floor. I remember not being able to get enough air. I remember hearing Annie outside telling me she was trying to get in. Annie looked down. Harold continued. I also remember thinking that if she walked away, I might not get another chance to ask for help. His voice grew weaker, but clearer. So if you're going to punish her for breaking that door, then at least ask yourselves why the door mattered more to this company than I did. Victor shifted forward. Harold, no one is suggesting your life mattered less than property. Harold looked at him. Then stopped building the argument, as if the property was the part she endangered. Elaine did not smile, but Grant saw something in her expression soften. One of the auditors cleared his throat. We also have a technical point that needs to be addressed. The access panel Annie described was tested after the incident. It had intermittent failure consistent with what she reported. The emergency request function did not reliably transmit. Victor's attorney turned toward the auditor. Was it completely dead? No. So Miss Carter's description that the system failed could be overstated. The auditor shook his head. Not in the practical sense. A safety system that works only intermittently during an emergency is still a safety failure. Grant watched Victor's face tighten. The second auditor opened a folder. We also verified the 3 calls from Miss Carter's phone. All reached the security console. None were answered. Victor leaned forward. Because the contractor failed to staff the desk properly. That explains one failure, Elaine said. It does not explain the panel, the missing report, or the closed maintenance complaints. Victor turned toward her. We are not discussing those yet. Elaine's voice remained calm. That is precisely why you would prefer to keep this hearing about a damaged door. Grant finally spoke. Elaine's right. Victor looked at him. Grant, this is supposed to be an objective review. It is. Then don't interfere. Grant leaned forward. I'm not interfering. I'm correcting the scope. Annie's actions did not happen in isolation. If we ask whether she broke policy without asking why every system before that point failed, then we are not reviewing the incident. We're trimming it down until only the easiest person to blame is left. Annie looked at him, surprised. Outside counsel made a note. Mr. Hollister. We'll get to management responsibility. I hope so. The attorney turned back toward Annie. Miss Carter, one last question. If the same thing happened tonight, knowing everything that followed the investigation, the videos, the pressure, would you still break the door? Annie thought for several seconds. Then she looked toward Harold. Yes. Even knowing you might lose your job? Yes. Why? Annie's answer came quietly. Because I got to go home and worry about a job. Mr. Bennett might not have gotten to go home at all. Harold lowered his head. Grant sat back slowly. The hearing had begun with a video that made Annie look reckless. By the end of the first hour, the room was no longer asking why she had broken the door. They were asking why she had been the only person in the building willing to act when everything designed to help had failed. The hearing resumed after a short break, but the mood in the room had changed. Annie was no longer the person under the brightest light. The attention had shifted toward the records. Elaine placed a new folder in front of outside counsel. We're ready to move to the incident report. Victor's attorney looked at the folder. The report Miss Carter says she filed? Elaine nodded. The report the active system no longer showed. A forensic IT specialist, named Mark Ellison, connected his laptop to the display. He was in his 40s, spoke without drama, and seemed more comfortable with timestamps than people. We recovered metadata from the reporting server and its backup logs, he said. At 2:08 a.m., a report was created from staff terminal S14 under Annie Carter's employee credentials. Annie looked toward Grant. He did not interrupt. Mark continued. The report included references to 3 unanswered security calls, an access panel failure, a medical emergency involving Mr. Bennett, and forced entry after the occupant stopped responding. Victor's attorney leaned forward. Are you saying the original report itself survived? Not in the active database. Parts of it survived in server logs and incremental backups. Can you establish that Miss Carter actually submitted it rather than saving a draft? Yes. The system generated a submission event and assigned a reference number. Annie let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the night Grant first questioned her. Elaine asked, what happened after submission? Mark changed the screen. At 8:17 the following morning, the report was opened using Facilities Administrator credentials from Workstation F12. At 8:24, the status was changed. At 8:31, it was removed from the active incident queue. Victor's attorney spoke quickly. Removed does not necessarily mean deleted. Correct. What could it mean? Archived, merged, reassigned, or deleted. So you cannot say, from that action alone, that someone was trying to hide it. No, not from that action alone. Victor leaned back slightly. Elaine did not react. What happened to the related maintenance ticket? Mark opened another screen. That's where the pattern changes. Grant leaned forward. The access panel complaint linked to that location had already been marked resolved. There was no technician completion note, no replacement serial number, and no verified service scan. Victor finally spoke. Again, documentation can be incomplete without being fraudulent. Elaine turned toward him. That's why we kept looking. She handed the next section to Harold. He adjusted his glasses and opened a spreadsheet. I reviewed payments to 3 maintenance vendors over the past 11 months. The largest discrepancies involved Hale Building Systems. Victor's jaw tightened. We've already discussed that vendor. Not the payments, Harold replied. Not in detail. He slid copies across the table. Sterling North paid for controller replacements, emergency access servicing, and preventive maintenance at multiple properties. We then physically checked a sample of the equipment that invoices said had been replaced. One of the auditors added, 4 of the first 5 controllers were still original units. Victor's attorney frowned. Could internal components have been replaced rather than the entire controllers? Harold shook his head. The invoice descriptions say full controller replacement. Victor said, then the vendor may have used incorrect billing language. Elaine looked at him. Repeatedly? It happens. Harold spoke before she could respond. The same technician was also billed for 4 hours of work at 2 separate properties at overlapping times. Victor looked down at the documents. Grant watched him carefully. Can you explain that? No. I wasn't personally checking every technician timesheet, Elaine said, but your department approved the invoices. My managers approved thousands of line items. And Hale Building Systems is owned by your nephew. Victor's attorney raised a hand. We are not going to imply criminal conduct based on a family relationship. Elaine remained calm. Then let's remove the implication and stick to records. The relationship was not disclosed in the conflict register. Payments increased. Documented work decreased. Several safety complaints were closed without corresponding repairs. Annie's incident report, which specifically identified one of those failures, was removed from active review the next morning using a facilities administrator account. Victor looked at Grant. You're letting them build a case out of coincidences. Grant answered carefully. I'm letting them finish. Harold moved to the next page. There's one more pattern. The facilities division reported significant operating savings over the same period. Victor's expression changed. Grant noticed. Harold looked directly at him. Those savings were presented to the executive committee as improved efficiency. Grant knew what was coming before Harold said it. Victor leaned forward. Grant, you approved those reports. The room went silent. Victor continued, no longer speaking defensively. You praised the cost reductions. You approved the performance targets. My department was told year after year to do more with less, and when we delivered lower numbers, nobody asked many questions. Grant's face tightened. Elaine looked at him, but she did not rescue him. Victor went on. You liked the savings. Grant stared at the spreadsheet. He remembered the quarterly meetings, the green arrows beside operating expenses, the congratulations, the bonuses, the brief satisfaction of seeing another percentage move in the right direction. Outside counsel asked, Mr. Hollister, did you personally approve the facilities budgets during this period? Grant looked up. Yes. Did you know maintenance work was not being completed as represented? No. Did you know safety complaints were being closed without proper repair documentation? No. Did you know Hale Building Systems had a family relationship with Mr. Hale? No. Victor gave a bitter laugh. Convenient. Grant turned toward him. For a moment, it looked as though he might defend himself. Instead, he said, No. It isn't convenient. The room quieted again. Grant folded his hands on the table. I did not know the work was being skipped. I did not know reports were disappearing. But my signature is on the budgets, and my approval is on the performance targets. Outside counsel asked, Are you accepting responsibility for conduct you say you didn't know about? I'm accepting responsibility for what my position required me to know. Victor stared at him. Grant continued, I rewarded lower costs without asking enough questions about how those savings were created. That does not excuse anyone who falsified records or took money, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend my title only gives me credit when the numbers look good. Elaine closed her folder. Accountability begins where excuses stop being useful. Grant nodded once. Annie watched him from across the table. The man who had nearly fired her because a video looked simple was now refusing the simplest defense available to him. Then Mark, the IT specialist, raised a hand. There is one additional recovery. Everyone turned toward him. He opened a final log. The administrator credentials used to remove Annie Carter's report were also used to close 7 of the older maintenance complaints. Victor's face went still. Mark looked at outside counsel. And all 7 actions came from the same facilities workstation. No one spoke. The pattern was no longer hiding inside separate systems. It was beginning to point in one direction. For several seconds after Mark finished speaking, Victor did not move. The screen behind him showed the same facilities workstation appearing again and again beside closed complaints, modified records, and Annie's missing report. What had looked like separate failures now formed a sequence too consistent to dismiss as clerical mistakes. Victor's attorney leaned toward him and whispered something. Victor shook his head. Outside counsel spoke first. Mr. Hale, before you answer anything further, you may want to confer privately with your attorney. Victor kept his eyes on Grant. No. I think everyone here should hear this. Grant said nothing. Victor pushed his chair back slightly. You all want this to be simple. 1 bad facilities director. 1 dishonest vendor. 1 clean explanation. Fine. But Sterling North wanted lower operating costs every quarter. We were praised when we delivered them. Harold frowned. Lower costs are not the same thing as billing for work that wasn't done. I didn't say they were. Elaine leaned forward. Then tell us what you are saying. Victor looked around the table. I'm saying this company rewarded the result and never wanted to know how ugly the process could get. Every department was told to cut. Maintenance contracts, security staffing, overtime, preventive service. We were supposed to make the numbers come down without letting the buildings look any different. Grant's voice remained controlled. Did that instruction include falsifying invoices? No. Did it include closing safety complaints when repairs hadn't been completed? No. Did it include removing Annie's report? Victor's expression hardened. I didn't remove her report. Then who did? I don't know. Mark turned his laptop slightly. The actions came from a facilities workstation assigned to the administrative office next to yours. Victor's attorney immediately said, "A location does not identify a user." Mark nodded. Correct. But access card data can tell us who entered that area during those times. Victor looked toward him. Elaine noticed. Have you checked it? Not yet. The data was preserved this morning. Victor's attorney stood. Then this discussion is over until we've reviewed those records. Outside counsel agreed. That is reasonable. We'll take a recess. Victor gathered his papers, but before leaving he looked at Grant. You know what happens if you send all of this outside the company? Grant met his eyes. I know what happens if I don't. Victor gave a humorless smile. Do you? Meridian walks. Other clients demand audits. Investors panic. People lose jobs who had nothing to do with any of this. And what do you suggest? Victor lowered his voice. Deal with the people responsible. Quietly. Replace the equipment. Refund whatever needs refunding. Terminate the contractor. And keep the rest contained. Elaine said. You mean keep the record contained? Victor ignored her. Grant asked, and Annie? Victor looked toward the far side of the room, where Annie sat beside Elaine. She violated policy. That remains true. Annie's face did not change. Grant stared at Victor. A man was having a cardiac emergency. Security failed, the access panel failed, and the report she filed afterward was removed. Yet somehow your solution still ends with the 18-year-old cleaner carrying the violation. Victor's patience finally broke. Because she did violate it. Grant stood, and because she had the least power in the room. No one spoke. Victor's attorney touched his arm. We're done for now. After they left, the remaining members of the review team stayed seated. The room felt larger without Victor in it. Outside counsel removed his glasses. Grant, you need to understand the decision in front of you. We can continue this investigation internally, while preserving evidence. That gives us time to establish exactly who did what before making external notifications. Elaine looked at him. And how long is time? A few days. Harold shook his head. A few days is enough time for every client in this city to hear a different version. Outside counsel replied, I'm talking about legal exposure, Harold, not public relations. Grant looked at the documents spread across the table. What notifications are mandatory now? The lawyer answered carefully. Potentially several, depending on how the facts develop. There may be contractual obligations to Meridian and other clients. There may be insurance notice requirements. If fraud is substantiated, that creates another set of issues. Elaine said, we already have false invoices, undisclosed family ties, deleted safety reports, and maintenance work that cannot be verified. Those are serious facts. I'm not minimizing them. Grant looked toward Annie. What happens to her record while we debate timing? Elaine answered. Right now, the preliminary incident description is still in the personnel system. Annie looked at Grant. The one that says aggressive tampering? Yes. Grant turned to outside counsel. Correct it. The lawyer hesitated. We should avoid language that appears retaliatory toward the original reviewers. I didn't ask you to blame anyone. I asked you to make her file factual. Elaine opened her notes. We can replace the characterization with a neutral description. Emergency intervention during a documented medical crisis, including forced access after designated emergency systems failed. Annie looked at her. And the word aggressive? Gone. Grant nodded. Do it today. A board member who had remained for the review, Richard Cole, finally spoke. Grant, that part is easy. The harder question is whether you're prepared to tell Meridian all of this before we know the final scope. Grant looked at him. Yes. Richard leaned back. You could lose the contract. Grant did not answer immediately. Richard continued. I'm not speaking in theory. That agreement is worth hundreds of millions over its term. Losing it affects hiring, expansion, debt planning, bonuses, maybe even headcount. Grant glanced toward Harold, then Annie, then the screen where the deleted reports still sat in rows. Then we lose the contract. Richard stared at him. You're willing to say that now because you haven't seen the market reaction. I'm saying it because the alternative is asking everyone in this building to pretend those reports weren't deleted. You could lose more than Meridian. I know. You could lose this company. Grant's voice stayed quiet. A company that survives by making an 18-year-old girl carry our lie isn't worth protecting that way. Annie looked down at her hands. Elaine closed her folder. Grant turned toward outside counsel. Prepare disclosure to Meridian. Notify the appropriate insurers and regulators based on your legal assessment. Preserve every facilities and security record across the portfolio. No routine deletions. No vendor contact without counsel. Victor is suspended pending the investigation. Richard exhaled. And if the board challenges you, they have that right. And if they ask you to step aside? Grant nodded once. Then I answer for my part too. Harold watched him. That includes the cost targets you approved? Yes. The bonuses? Yes. Grant looked around the room. I don't get to demand accountability from Victor, and then excuse myself because I signed from a nicer office. By evening, the first notices had gone out. Meridian responded less than an hour later. The contract review was suspended indefinitely. Sterling North's legal team began preparing for outside audits. Victor's access credentials were disabled. The security contractor received a formal preservation notice. Elaine ordered copies of every complaint before anyone could touch the originals. Annie's personnel record was corrected before she left the building. She stood beside Elaine's desk and read the new wording twice. Then she looked at Grant. That's all I wanted the first night. Grant nodded. I know. No, I don't think you did. He accepted that without arguing. Annie handed the document back to Elaine. For the first time since she had stood in front of him with a pry bar frozen on a security screen, the official record no longer told people what to think about her. It simply told the truth. Almost a year later, the 34th floor looked the same at first glance. The carpet had been replaced, the walls repainted, and the damaged door outside Harold Bennett's office was gone. But the hallway still carried the same quiet hum after business hours. Annie noticed the difference only when she stopped in front of the new access panel. A green status light glowed steadily beside the door. Below it sat a second emergency call button with a printed notice explaining that unanswered requests would automatically route to a backup security center. A small inspection label showed the date of the most recent physical test, along with the initials of the technician who had actually performed it. Annie reached out and touched the edge of the label. You checking their work? She turned and found Grant Hollister walking toward her with his coat over one arm. Annie smiled faintly. Maybe. I thought you were in class tonight. I was. We got out early. Grant glanced at the textbook tucked under her arm. Emergency management? Intro course. How is it? More paperwork than I expected. Grant laughed. That may be the first realistic thing anyone has ever told me about emergency management. Annie looked back at the panel. At least the paperwork is supposed to match what actually happened. Grant heard the meaning beneath the joke and nodded. That lesson cost us enough. The investigation had taken most of the year. Victor Hale was no longer employed by Sterling North. Several vendor contracts had been terminated, and records tied to questionable payments had been turned over to the proper authorities. The security contractor that had left the night desk uncovered was replaced. Sterling North had lost the Meridian contract, and for months Grant's name had appeared in stories about oversight failures, compliance reviews, and executive responsibility. He had also given up his annual bonus and stepped away from several internal compliance decisions while outside reviewers examined the company's procedures. Sterling North survived, but it was smaller, more cautious, and far less proud of its own paperwork. Annie had stayed on the night crew for several more months. When the company's tuition assistance enrollment opened, Elaine showed her how to apply under the same rules used by every other eligible employee. Annie enrolled at a local community college and reduced her work schedule to 3 nights a week. Grant had offered nothing special. Annie had been very clear about that. If I earn something, she had told him, I want to know I earned it. Grant had answered, fair enough. Now he nodded toward the new panel. They test that one every month. I know. You read the inspection reports? I know people downstairs. That sounds dangerous. It probably is. They began walking toward the elevators. Halfway there, Grant stopped. Annie. She turned. There's something I've been meaning to say without lawyers, investigators, or a conference table between us. Her expression became more cautious. Okay. Grant rested his coat over the back of a nearby chair. I owe you an apology. Annie gave him a small look. For firing me? For more than that. She waited. Grant glanced toward Harold's office. I watched a silent video and decided I understood the whole story. I saw your uniform, the pry bar, the damaged lock, and I thought the record had already told me who you were. Annie said nothing. I was angry before I asked you one question that mattered. If you hadn't kept insisting that I look at your phone, I would have sent you out of the building with a disciplinary record attached to your name. You did almost do that. I know. Grant looked at her directly. And I've spent a lot of time asking myself why it was so easy for me to believe the worst version first. Annie shifted the textbook against her hip. Did you figure it out? Some of it. She waited again. Grant continued. I trusted the system because I was the person sitting at the top of it. That made it easy for me to assume the people underneath it were being treated fairly. I also think I gave more weight to the words in a report than I gave to the person standing in front of me. Annie looked toward the old office door. The report said, aggressive tampering. Yes. You remember that other report about the technician? Manual troubleshooting. She nodded. Same screwdriver, different words. Grant lowered his head briefly. I remember. Annie looked back at him. You told me that night you thought you were looking at evidence. I was. You were, she said. You just weren't looking at all of it. Grant did not answer right away. That's probably the sentence I'll remember longest. Annie's mouth curved slightly. I've said worse things to you. Elaine has too. That doesn't surprise me. They continued down the hallway. When they reached the old doorway, Grant stopped again. You broke this one pretty badly. Annie looked at the new frame and smiled. It needed opening. Grant laughed softly, then became serious. Do you ever think about that night? Sometimes. What part? He expected her to mention Harold on the floor, the ambulance lights reflecting against the windows, or standing in the conference room while Grant demanded her badge. Instead, Annie said, the phone. The phone? She nodded. I remember hearing it ring. Grant watched her. First call. I thought somebody would answer any second. Second call. I started getting scared. By the third one, I was looking at that door thinking I might really be on my own. Grant looked toward the new emergency button. 3 calls. 3. And nobody answered. No. A security officer came around the corner carrying a tablet. He was in his 50s and wore reading glasses low on his nose. When he saw Annie, he lifted a hand. Evening, Annie. Hey, Mr. Lewis. He stopped at the panel, scanned the inspection sticker, and pressed the test function. A tone sounded. A voice came through almost immediately. Backup security center. Test signal received. Can I confirm location? 34th floor accounting suite, Lewis replied. Confirmed. Signal is clear. Thank you. The connection ended. Lewis made a note on his tablet and continued down the hallway. Annie watched him go. Grant looked at her. That answer your question? She rested one hand against the strap of her bag. I guess somebody answers now. Grant smiled, but Annie was already walking toward the elevators. He remained by the door for a moment. A year earlier, a camera had shown Annie Carter breaking into an office, and nearly everyone with authority had treated the image as the whole truth. What the camera had not captured were 3 unanswered calls, a failed safety system, a frightened man behind a locked door, and an 18-year-old employee deciding that a human life mattered more than a rule she had been told never to break. Grant had once believed Annie destroyed a door. In the end, he understood that she had opened one, and once the truth passed through it, Sterling North could never close it the same way again. The story reminds us that truth is rarely found in the first image, the first report, or the first accusation. Real justice begins when we slow down long enough to listen, especially to people who have less power and fewer chances to defend themselves. Rules and systems matter, but they should protect human beings, not silence them. Annie's courage shows that doing the right thing can come with a cost, while Grant's journey proves that true leadership means admitting when you are wrong and accepting responsibility for what happens under your authority. In the end, fairness is not charity or kindness. It is having the courage to make sure the full truth is seen, This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.